stop it, I would stop it. Believe me.
How are you hot?
Because my body's ridiculous. That's really all it is. It's not anything normal. It's lupus. It's fun. Lupus is like a fun little game of guessing what's coming next. So you never know. Every day is different. Fun times. So we got Senya, and we should have Sky hopefully in a minute. Where is Jocelyn? I'm gonna grab one more tissue because it's making me crazy. My allergies have been nuts. Actually growing about a week and a half ago has kicked my butt, and it's just made my nose run like crazy, which is, not too terrible. But then when you got a mask on, it's this maddening snot, snap, snip, snip, snort. I hate it. Gross. I want to get to the point where we all don't have to wear masks all the time.
Hi, Miss Danny.
Morning.
Morning.
She looks cold. Okay. I wonder what
I am cold.
today. Somebody asked her what the
I'm
temperature.
tired. I'm cold and tired.
Cold. Ask her again. I'll be sure.
She said I'm cold and tired.
Yeah.
I said, Sienna.
They're wondering what's the forecast in Connecticut today. We're always fascinated with your weather.
It said it was supposed to be sunny. But
right.
right now, that's what it looks like. It's cloudy and cold.
Cloudy. It's cold right now?
Yes.
Well, you had snow last week, and this week it's supposed to get to 81 here today. So there you go.
Lucky.
Lucky, I don't know. I'll take your cold over our 81. Yes, sir.
I take your 81 over my cold.
What, Drew?
That shows my science pictures.
Is it Rico or?
No.
No, that's for a couple weeks from now. Not yet.
You can't show them the picture.
Don't. That ruins it.
Remember that?
Yes, it does. All right. Well, the D'Antoni girls are still on their way. Well, we're going to go ahead and get us started. So as you guys know, we are almost to the end, aren't we? Woohoo! Here we go. Let her in. She's in. Good deal. So we are almost to the end here. We've got very little left to do. We're going to finish up today's lesson, and then next week is a lesson, and then there are no more lessons. It's
I
just
should probably start my final project then.
good deal. Well, I know a couple people have already started and some people have finished. So
I haven't started my project yet. I honestly haven't looked at what element I got or anything.
I finished my artwork and I finished the typing thing.
yeah, it's going to be very interesting. I can't wait to see what everybody does. It should be a lot of fun.
Are you graded on like how good the typing is?
No, no, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and start? So if everybody, I think that, both my cyber girls and then you guys have the game that we're doing today. You have that at home. So it might be easier for you all to actually kind of do next week's lesson a little bit before you try the lab, because I won't count this one late until after next week, because I'm going to give a little explanation today before we start lab. And that should kind of cover what you guys haven't covered yet in a lesson, just a little bit. So today's lab is going to be about DNA and mRNA. And next week's lab, you guys are going to get to look at your own DNA, which should be really cool. We're going to look at DNA of an onion, and then we're going to look at our own DNA. So I'm very excited about that. This lab turn in? No, this lab's fun. It's going to be fun. It's a game, and you're going to end up making sentences, basically.
But you said cards were involved.
There are cards involved, but it's not cards like playing cards. It's different. It should be fun. Yep.
Safe from.
Yeah, no, it should be cool. All right, so let me get my screen shared for you guys. And oops, actually, I meant to share the other version of that. I don't like that one. I like this one. Oops. All right. Here come my D'Antoni girls. I hear them walking. Hello, ladies. How are you? Good to you, Miss Ella. Where's Jules?
She's got it.
Oh my God, you're missing someone. Oh my goodness. All right, so today we are talking about biological chemistry this week and next. You okay, Bumper? Yeah, this week and next. And next week is DNA, and this week is about kind of just lightly touching on all the other biological chemistry. And again, this is another one of those topics that you could go into, like nuclear chemistry, where you could spend your whole life working in it. I mean, we have it down condensed into one lesson, and we're just hitting the really, really high points. It's actually a topic that's super in-depth and involved. So the first thing we have is carbohydrates and lipids. So when somebody talks about, oh, I'm on a low carb diet, people do that a lot. So when they do that, what are they avoiding?
Carbs.
Yeah, what's an example of a carb? Sugar, okay, Donuts, yeah, that's something you might avoid in a low carb diet. What else is something you might avoid?
Cinnamon buns, candy.
Cinnamon buns, yeah,
Basically all.
Yeah, a lot of sugars and usually a lot of breads and grains and things like that, right? Yeah, so my husband always does low carb, and I kind of keep low carb in general. And so you may hear of people doing that. All right, now lipids. Do you know what lipids are? Lipids are fats, basically. Okay, so but there are lipids involved in all kinds of processes in your body that are supposed to be there. So let's talk about carbohydrates for a few minutes. Okay, so what's a carbohydrate? It's a naturally occurring compound or a derivative of that kind of a compound with a chemical formula, and it always has these three elements. It's always carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And basically what it means here by CX and H2OY means that it always has some number of C and then some number of H2O. And these are also the most widespread organic substances. So if you were to look out the windows here right now, or Jocelyn and Senya and Sky, look out your windows, you see all those leaves on the trees. Those are definitely lower carb foods that were the food you were eating, like a salad maybe, but those still contain carbohydrates, lots of carbohydrates. And they play a very vital role in life. You have to have carbohydrates to function. So what's the structure of a carbohydrate? So they are hydrates of carbon. So think back to what I said a second ago right here, where I said that they are all composed of what? I said it's a carbon and an oxygen, and a water of some kind, right? It was right, where'd it go? Oh my goodness, hang on. Hello, I went forward instead of backward. Wow, right here. I said it's always carbon and some water, right? So then what we say is they are hydrates of carbon, which means it's water with some carbon. Yes.
Never mind.
Okay. And they've got this generic structure of a certain number of carbons, a certain number of hydrogens, which is always double your number of oxygen. See your N here and here. It's just showing this relationship is the same. So we got three main categories of carbs. We've got monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So for a minute, forget the saccharide part. And what does mono mean when you hear mono? Anybody know what mono means? It's another one of those, we talk about Latin and Greek prefixes and suffixes and roots. You know, mono? How about monotone or monotonous, which comes from monotone? Or what's another good one? Mono a mono you hear sometimes. Oh, I'll fight you, mono a mono. No, the mono's one. All right, mono means one. And then how about di? What does di mean? As a verb, you would be dead. Yes, di as in D-I, Goober. Di as in D-I. Anybody want to guess what di is? We talked about, remember dipole? We talked about that.
Artificial dye.
Artificial dye. Well, when you see dye like this and it's DI, it means two. Now, poly, you probably recognize because we had poly last week, didn't we? What's poly? Remember? So poly means many. There's a great word. I love this word. The word is polymath. If you've ever heard polymath, it's a person that is very well versed or educated in multiple different disciplines. That's a polymath. So we have monosaccharides. So that's one saccharide, whatever that is, right? Disaccharides would be two, and then polysaccharides would be lots of saccharides. So here's your monosaccharides. Mono is one. Now here's where we get saccharide, sweet. All right. Do you recognize this at all? Have you ever seen this word or anything like it, similar to it? Does it sound familiar?
I've seen it one time in my grammar book.
In your grammar book? Okay. So saccharide is sweet. And you may have, okay, you ever heard of saccharin? Anybody ever heard of saccharin? You ever seen Sweet and Low packages, little pink packages that you use as sweeteners? Never seen Sweet and Low?
Maybe.
It's got the
Yeah.
little music symbols on it, little pink package. They're usually on tables when you go to the restaurant and they have sugar and all those the yellow stuff,
Yeah.
the blue stuff, the pink stuff. You know what I mean? The pink
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah. So there's pink stuff and then there's blue stuff. And so the pink stuff is saccharin, the blue stuff is aspartame, and then the yellow stuff is sucralose. But they're all different artificial sweeteners. But saccharin, obviously that is named for sweet, right? So these are simple sugars. The most common of these is glucose. So we're talking about carbohydrates. You said sugars, right? You said sweet things. Absolutely. This is why. Because these are simple sugars. And so our most common is glucose. Where's your glucose in your body? Do you know? It's everywhere. But it's the glucose is the one of the fuels your body uses to function. And if you're somebody who's diabetic, you're probably really familiar with glucose because when diabetics check their blood sugar, that's what they're checking is the level of glucose in their blood.
Oh, I have a cousin with diabetes.
Yeah. And that can be, there's different types of diabetes. You can get diabetes from not eating well, and it messes up the way your body's supposed to function, and your organs kind of get all screwed up, and you get into a situation where you're diabetic. It's genetic. You can also, there's also a type you can get from actually having a virus that screws up your pancreas. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you can get diabetes. And there's different types. But if you are diabetic, that's one thing that you check is your blood sugar. And if your blood sugar is low, you need to eat some sugar. If your blood sugar is high, usually you take insulin, which is insulin is what your body produces to keep your blood sugar level in check. So if your blood sugar is too high, you would artificially take some insulin, like a shot, or sometimes people now have pumps. Have you ever seen the insulin pumps? They're so cool. My next door neighbor has one. So it used to be the kind of thing where people who were diabetic, whose blood sugar fluctuated a lot during the day, they had to constantly poke their fingers, check their blood all day long. I worked summer camp in the 90s with a kid who was like that, a little boy. He probably came to me 3 times a day and tell me, Miss Danny, I feel low. Miss Danny, I feel high. And the poor kid was constantly poking his fingers. It was incessant. But now they have these pumps. And it's really, the whole thing is like, it's like an idiot-proof system. You unwrap it and you stick it on and there's a thing you push and you pull it off and the pumps attach. Usually they attach them to like their thigh or sometimes I think maybe a belly. And then it has like a little catheter that goes in and a tiny little needle and all that comes out. And yeah,
Some people
they're itty bitty.
Yeah, some people use it on
On their arms, yep. And it monitors your blood sugar at the same time giving insulin as needed. So those are really effective. They're great. So that's where glucose comes in. And next year, when we talk about biology, we'll talk a lot about glucose because it's essential. Another thing people say, and I want you to realize this when we're talking about monosaccharides, but people say all the time, I don't eat any sugar. You ever hear people say that? I don't eat any sugar. That's impossible. You'd be dead. Absolutely dead. What they mean is I don't eat any added sugar. Like I don't eat foods to which they've added, typically what we use is cane sugar or corn syrup, and we add it to sweeten our food. And that's what they mean. I don't eat any food where they've added sugar. But
This is still not very good.
an apple has sugar, a steak has sugar, an egg,
Sugar?
absolutely. An egg has sugar. All these things have sugar. If you didn't have sugar, you couldn't survive. You need it. You absolutely need it, but you don't need too much of it. So if anybody ever says to you, I don't eat any sugar, they don't know what they're talking. Either they assume that you don't know the difference or they don't know the difference. So, but it might be,
both.
or both. I mean, I remember I saw one of those, you know, those man on the street type interviews. I saw a guy who went to it was a jogging trail in California where all these like healthy people, all the granola types, they were jogging. And he was stopping them and asking them whether they were gluten-free. And a lot of them were like, yeah, I'm gluten-free. And he's like, well, what's gluten? And they were all, well, it's bad for you. Nobody even knew what it was, but they'd cut it out of their diet. So people do that a lot. They do whatever they think is the healthy
Gluten in
thing.
bread.
Yeah, gluten is. It is correct. It's in.
When I went to the summer
grains.
camp I had, it's called Camp Michael.
Yeah.
It's this like a Christian camp.
It's a diocesan church camp. Uh-huh.
And when we went there's this like one day out of the week where you have communion. And it was so funny because, you know, we had all these kids line up and they were giving us, you know, communion, like bread and wine.
Hmm.
And they had two lines, one for normal bread and one for gluten-free bread.
Yeah, they still have that. We have that at our church too. It's just that we don't make a separate line.
It was.
They know. Were there more people than you thought necessary in the gluten-free line? Is that what it was?
No one went.
No.
No one.
Oh, no one went. They offered it and no one went. That's funny.
The gluten-free, everyone went inside the normal one. Not a single
Well,
one.
it's interesting when you get into theological stuff, because like some denominations don't allow a completely gluten-free option, whereas others will allow a completely gluten-free option. It's interesting. So anyway, the number of carbons in your monosaccharide is usually going to range between 3 and 7, and most monosaccharide names end with the suffix "ose." So if you hear sucrose, glucose, dextrose, maltose, these are all things you can turn over the back of a package in your pantry and find any of those. Those are sugars. So you may see maltose or dextrose. Those are pretty common, and those are sugars for sure. All right, if the sugar is in an aldehyde group, remember we talked about functional groups? If it's in an aldehyde group, then it's got this structure R, which meant root, remember, and then CHO. And it's known as an aldose sugar. And if it has a ketone group, then it's RC, and then there's this ORR, and they call them ketoses. So all you need to know really is that sugars can be in different groups, have different functional groups, different things going on. And then here's a little graphic for you. So depending on the number of carbons in the sugar, they also may be known as trioses, meaning they have 3 carbons, pentoses, which is 5, and hexoses, which is 6. So there's a good little graphic for you here. Here are monosaccharides, right here, here, and here. So this is aldose, ketose, triose, pentose, hexose. And an example of a hexose right here would be glucose. So there it is. When you eat something and it gets into your bloodstream, this is the molecule you're looking for when you're checking your blood sugar levels. And, you know, doctors will check like your blood sugar levels after you've had a meal, or they'll check them. Sometimes it's called fasting blood sugar, where you go in the morning and you haven't eaten anything and then they draw your blood. That's always fun. So then you get your disaccharides. So your disaccharides form when 2 monosaccharides undergo a dehydration reaction. What did hydration mean when we're talking about chemical reactions? Do you remember? Hydration means you add a water. So if it's a dehydration, the water is
It
removed.
doesn't have enough water.
Well, water's taken out, right? So if you have 2 monosaccharides, which as you remember is like a certain number of carbons and then water, and you take the water away, then we call that condensation, right? Because now you've quote unquote produced water. That water has come out, right? And then it's called dehydration synthesis or condensation, and then you've got a disaccharide. So during that process, the hydroxyl group, if you've got that functional group going on, of one of the monosaccharides combines with the hydrogen of another monosaccharide, releasing a molecule of water, forming a covalent bond. And then you go, this is just so you know, you don't need to know any of this, like know it, but a covalent bond forms between the carbohydrate molecule and another molecule, in this case, between 2 monosaccharides. And then you get what they call a glycosidic bond. And these can be alpha or beta. There's all kinds of types, right? And then your alpha bonds form when you've got this OH group, and then you've got beta bonds. You don't really need to know that stuff just know it exists, that there's all kinds of details once you get into it. Mainly, if you've got 2 monosaccharides and you take a water away, you have dehydrated or condensed, right? And your water has formed, and then you've got a disaccharide. Your polysaccharides are what we call long chain of monosaccharides, and they're linked by these glycosidic bonds. So a long chain of them. So you went from one molecule that's already long to 2 molecules that's much longer now. They've combined into one larger molecule. And then you get this gigantic chain, right? And they're all glycosidic bonds the whole way down. And the chain can be branched, as in this case, or unbranched. Gets very complicated. And they can have different types of monosaccharides, and your molecular weight can be pretty high because they can be very, very, very big. And then you get stuff in here like starch, glycogen, cellulose, and chitin are primary examples of polysaccharides. Okay, so starch. When we're talking about carbohydrates, most people, when they say like I'm on a low carb diet, usually what they're avoiding is starch, because those are the big carbs, right? The big long carbs. So when they don't have donuts or pizza or anything that has bread in it, it's because that's a starch, right? What's another example of a starch you might eat at a meal? What's something starchy you might eat? Pasta, that's a good one. How about potatoes? Yeah, pasta, potatoes, bread, all that stuff. All right, and then glycogen. Now here's a good one, cellulose. This is one you should know. So what's cellulose? All right, if you look out there again at all those lovely trees, or if you imagine leaves on a tree, or any vegetable, yep, or any vegetable that you're going to eat. Cellulose is actually a component of the cell walls of plant cells, okay? And we cannot digest cellulose. If we eat cellulose, it goes right through our system. So we tend to refer to it sort of broadly as fiber. So when people say, oh, you need to eat a high fiber diet, or you need more fiber in your diet, that's why. Because we can't digest cellulose. We need it. We need to be able to eat it because it bulks up our waste so we can actually poop. Because without cellulose, enough cellulose, you can't poop. That's why people get constipated. And then when you ever seen the commercials for like all the fiber pills you can take, or the yogurt with the fiber in it keeps you regular? That's why, because you need cellulose in your body in order to be able to get rid of waste. And then chitin is a similar type of structure that is actually formed in fungus, like mushrooms are made of chitin. So those are some examples of polysaccharides. So here's how they break down. Your carbohydrates are either simple or complex, and your simple ones are what we're going to call your monos and your dis. And there's examples. Glucose, galactose. I love galactose. Doesn't it sound like some sugar formed in space? It really does. Like, this is the sugar formed on stars, galactose. And then fructose. Fructose comes from fruits, right? Vegetables, things like that. And then your disaccharides. Okay, where do you get lactose from? Does that sound familiar? Milk. Good. Very good. Sucrose. Sucrose is going to come from, that's your table sugar, is sucrose. And cane sugar, corn syrup. Maltose. Yeah, maltose comes from corn too, I think, and also wheat. You can get sugar from there. I don't know where this one comes from. And then you got these break down into, lactose breaks down into glucose and galactose. Maltose and trehalose break down into glucose and glucose. And then sucrose breaks down into glucose and fructose. So if you see, look, everything breaks down into glucose, which means when you eat anything containing any of these sugars in your body, it breaks down to glucose, which is why that's what's in your blood. Makes sense, right? And then your complex ones, we've got the polysaccharides that we talked about. So these have more than 2, but less than 10 carbons in them and units in them. So you've got starch, glycogen, dietary fiber, there it is, cellulose, right? And they all break down into glucose, except if you look, do you notice that cellulose does not break down? There it goes. So I'll ask you this, what's the little insect that eats wood? That cause trouble to all, yeah, termites. Okay, so for those of you northerners on here, Jocelyn, you may not have this issue, but every house in Georgia has to have a termite bond, which means that it's inspected every year for termites because they're so common in the South, right? They thrive here. Next year, we're actually going to be doing a behavioral experiment with termites. It's going to be really fun. Yeah. So these termites, are they able to digest the cellulose if they eat wood? Think about it.
No.
You say no. What do you say, Lily? You had an opinion. Lily said you shook your head yes. What do y'all think? Yeah, no, maybe, sort of. You think yes? So you would think, because that's all they eat, right? But actually they can't, but there is a microbe in their digestive system that can, which is really weird. So what they eat, their primary and only food source really, isn't something they can physically digest. It's broken down by a microbe in their gut, which is pretty fascinating because if that's what we call, a great symbiotic relationship, because without that microbe in their gut, they wouldn't survive. So then oligosaccharides, these are the giant ones, and we're not going to focus too much on them, but they break down into these, which then break down into these. And if you notice, lo and behold, once again, glucose from everything. So polysaccharides go to glucose, oligosaccharides go to glucose, disaccharides and monosaccharides, everything except cellulose is going to break down into glucose, which is why it's a food source for us. All these things are different food sources for us. So condensation, we talked about this a little bit last week. Here it is again. It's when you have a water form, right? So your simple sugar molecules, your monosaccharides combine, they form a larger molecule, and then you get water, right? And the reaction in which simple sugars combine to form larger ones is known as condensation, or as we said, dehydration. Either way, same thing. And you generate that water. So when you think about condensation, you think about, water on the outside of your glass, ice cold glass. You're not actually generating that water. It was already in the atmosphere. You just caused all the little water molecules to come together. But in this case, you actually are creating the water, you're removing it from the molecule that it was a part of. So it is now a separate water molecule all on its own. So you got one glucose, one fructose, they combine together in a condensation reaction, and that's what it looks like, if you would care to know what it looks like. Now, hydrolysis is going to be the opposite. It's the reverse of condensation. And it's when you break them down and you form water. Formation of water is hydrolysis. Means breaking. Lysis means break. Hydro means water. So you break it and there's water. Now, when you we'll do lysis a lot next year. You'll see that root in a lot of things because it means splitting or breaking. So it's used in a fair amount in biology, more than we've used it this year. So it's called hydrolysis because a water molecule is needed to cleave, which means to break the glycosidic bond. Cleave is one of these weird words. You heard this word cleave before? You know what a meat cleaver is? It's that big square knife with the handles. You go whack, you smack the meat and have you cleave it. Cleave is a word that can mean the exact opposite depending on how you use it. It can mean to split apart, or it can mean to join together, depending on how you use it. The most common use of it as meaning join together is actually a biblical one, where there's a phrase about marriage where it says a man will leave his family and cleave to his wife, meaning join together, whereas it can also mean split apart. It's one of those weird words where you have to totally look at the context of the sentence. We don't have too many of them, but that's one of them. And then the reaction mechanism for condensation reaction is the exact reverse of hydrolysis, which makes sense, right? In one, you're taking water and breaking things, taking a water and break things, and then the other one, you got a water coming out, exact opposites. So here's lipids real quick. Lipids, all right, lipids break down into these main categories: fatty acids, glycerides, non-glyceride lipids, something on my screen, yuck, what is that? I don't even know. And complex lipids. So any class of organic compounds that are fatty acids, that's what we call them, or their derivatives, are lipids. Then these are non-polar. So I want you to remember when we talked about surfactants and we talked about water molecules being polar, and then we talked about how surfactants were bipolar. Do you remember? They had a polar end and a non-polar end. And the polar end would, because like dissolves like, right? So one attached to the water and one attached to the oils or greases on your dishes in the sink when you're using your dish, right? And help split it apart. Well, that's exactly what happens here with lipids. You can use, we said like dissolves like many times, right? So if you wanted to dissolve or use a solvent for something that is already fatty, you would pick something else that's fatty. I actually did that yesterday on something. I was trying to get something off of something and I couldn't clean it no matter what. So I finally gave up, and it was something that I knew had a oily or lipidy type construction. So I actually used coconut oil and it came off. Go figure. You never know, right? It's always surprising. So they're insoluble in water. Think about this. If you pour oil into water, does it dissolve? Nope. But soluble in organic solvents. All right, another thing about lipids. So some medications that you use are going to be lipid based. And these are the ones, if you ever see or know of anybody who has to use a medication that they inject into like belly fat, like I have a couple of these that I have to do for lupus stuff. And those are ones that are actually, they're lipid based. So they work when they are injected into fat. If you get like the COVID vaccine, for example, that one goes in a muscle. So those are different. And then they can include oils, waxes, and also steroids. Steroids. Okay, when I say steroids, what do you think? I know what you think. What do you think when I say steroids? What's the? Don't go there. Like where do you hear about steroids being used? You think? Have you ever taken a steroid? Never? So steroids in your body. What's the matter? You need something? Oh, there's tissues behind you. So steroids are in your body, they function as anti-inflammatories. So if you're having, say you have croup or an asthma attack or a really bad infection, you might get a steroid from your doctor. Your body's going to already be producing it. Your body produces natural steroids. But as an anti-inflammatory, your doctor may give you extra to help fight whatever's going on. So that's pretty common.
Depending on the ones you get, they increase testosterone.
Some of them, yeah, I was gonna say, some of them can make, there are the high performance steroids, right? These are the ones that you hear about athletes getting in trouble for taking. Have you heard about that? Like some athletes take steroids so that they can perform better. And then it does increase testosterone in your body, whether you're male or female, increases that hormone. And then it can make people more aggressive. They call it roid rage. So it can happen. Yep. So you've got triglycerides, phospholipids, and steroids, and these are just different structures. And I wanted to show you kind of what the pictures look like. So if you remember, we did talk about micelles a while ago, and that's when you get your water molecules all arranged like this. Remember, where all of the polar heads and the nonpolar tails are facing a different way, right? These are the little phospholipids. You get that micellar water. You see it, or micellar water, I think is what they call it at the store to clean your face. Ooh, it's special. I don't know. You see that all the time. So proteins, we're going to touch on proteins. Proteins are large organic compounds made of amino acids. All right, amino acids are very important. Sometimes there's a cute little meme you might see, and there's jokes made about how they're amino acid, and they show a little angry thing. But amino acids are your building blocks of your proteins. They are the most basic chemical structures that your body uses, or any living thing uses, to form just about everything. So when we get into DNA today in the lab, and girls, when you get to do your lab at home, those of you who are doing it at home, DNA is a big long chain of code, basically code, just like you would do with computers. Like, it's not binary actually, because it's got 4 going instead of 2, right? But it's this big long code. All right, and then you've got RNA, mRNA, which comes in, it unzips it, and then it will build another chain on it. And what it does is it builds in units of 3. We call them codons. So there'll be 3 pieces of code that chunks together, and that's 1 codon. 3 more pieces of code, and that's 1 codon. And you'll get millions of these chunks of 3. Then your combinations of your chunks of 3 together form a gene. And that is what tells your body what protein to form. So if you think about it like from a developmental standpoint, embryologically, right? You've got DNA in a little embryo, and it's replicating and it's doing its thing, and it's building proteins, and it's telling, the combination of genes is telling the cell whether to build muscle protein, whether to build the tissue that makes bones, whether to build the tissue that makes nervous system. Every bit of that is being coded for in little chunks of 3, billions and billions of times. And it's happening in all of us constantly, incessantly, faster than you can imagine, faster than computers, it's constant, which is really wild to think about. It's very complex and it's super cool. So amino acids come in a nice long linear chain, and they're joined by this carboxyl atom of one amino acid and an amine nitrogen. Don't need to worry about that much. But proteins can get a little crazy looking, because see how complex this molecule is? Remember we went from water at the beginning of the year that was like Mickey Mouse, and now we're at this? I mean, that's wow, right? So a protein, they call the bonds within a protein peptide bonds. And the sequence of amino acid in a protein is defined by a gene and encoded in the genetic code. So the fact that Ella has brown eyes and Drew has blue eyes is all about protein coding inside of DNA, which is inside of chromosomes, which is inside of cells, tiny, 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 itty bitty. So although the code specifies only 20, this is where it's crazy, 20 standard amino acids in a protein, there are often chemically altered post-translational modification, all this stuff can go on, but there are only 20 standard amino acids. So it's the huge, huge, huge number you get from the multiple possible combinations of 20 in units of 3. So it's like I gave you 20 different colored Legos and I said, stick those 20 Legos together as 3. And you picked 3 of the 20 and you stuck them together and it was like red, blue, green. And you'd say, okay, that's one codon. And then multiple codons are gonna put a gene together. So you say, okay, that's one codon. All right, well, wait a minute. Take the same 3 and arrange them every possible way. Then put those 3 back and get 3 new ones. And then next time, put 2 of those 3 back, but keep 1 and get 2, 1 more. There are so many combinations. You can imagine, right? How many different ways could you do it? And that's why we have so many that's why we have such genetic variety. So proteins can also work together to achieve particular function, and they often associate to form stable complexes. Like other biological macromolecules, remember that means big molecules, such as polysaccharides and nucleic acids, which we're going to talk about today. Proteins are essential parts of all living organisms, participate in every process in living cells. And many proteins are enzymes. We talked about enzymes, right? They're natural catalysts, so they speed up biochemical reactions, and that's what keeps our metabolism moving. And then other proteins have structural or mechanical functions, such as the proteins in the cytoskeleton, which form a system of scaffolding that maintains cell shape. So think about that. Your cells, even though our cells aren't like plant cells where they're very rigid, they still have a shape. They're not completely mushy and malleable. One thing within them is this cytoskeleton that's sort of like you ever seen scaffolding on the outside of a building? It's kind of like that. Goes inside of the cell and kind of keeps it in shape. So they're also important in signaling, immune response, cell adhesion, cell cycle, necessary component of diet. And since animals cannot synthesize all the amino acids, you must obtain essential amino acids from food. So this is where it's important to remember about eating protein. All right, we can make a lot of these 20 amino acids, but we cannot make all of the 20. And some of the 20 we need, but we can't make them ourselves. So we have to get them from our food. So the more high protein food you eat, the more ability you'll have to do a lot of this stuff we're talking about here, where we're talking about cell signaling and immune response and cell adhesion. It's also repair, all those types of things that happen in your body. So high protein diets are good. So through the process of digestion, animals break down ingested protein into free amino acids, and then we use them for protein synthesis. So we eat a steak, we get a protein, we break that protein down into whatever combination of those 20 amino acids it came from. We break them down into individual amino acids. So it's like taking a Lego structure and crashing it on the floor, right? Which is a terrible thought. And then especially if you spent hours on it, right? And then you take those and create something completely new from it. So just envision that next time you eat a hamburger, envision that you've got this awesome, or if you don't eat hamburgers, beans or anything else that's high in protein. And you've got this great Lego structure that cow built or whatever the beans built, and you go crash. What else can you build from it now? Because you have all these new free amino acids that you can build into hair or eyes. It can become keratin and make hair. Like, that's crazy, right? Like you could take a steak and those same amino acids could be in your hair or your nails or your skin. I mean, a weird thought, right? Very weird thought. So they're formed by condensation. Again, we condense our amino acids, water comes out, ta-da, and then we have got ourselves. Some proteins. So the form and function of a protein depend on three-dimensional shape. And here are some of the shapes. Wow, some of that is super funky, right? Look at that. So you've got protein structures. Here's your amino acids. You've got A helixes, polypeptide chains, complex proteins. These things get wacky looking, very wacky looking. So here's some protein in the human body, right? You got your cytoskeleton in your cells, which we talked about. Keratin, that's your hair, your skin, your nails. You want to make it easier on your body to grow nice, long, healthy hair, pretty nails, ladies or gentlemen, if that's what you're into, then take some extra keratin. They make keratin pills. You can take them. If I'm working on growing my hair, I take them. They're good for you. They help. Collagen too. That's another one that's in hair and nails. That's also in connective tissue in your body. So collagen right here, this is the one that kicks my rear end. There are multiple types of collagen. And so collagen makes up your connective tissues, like your ligaments and your tendons and all the tissues that, I mean, all the chemicals and whatnot that bind your skin together and all those types of things. And in people that deal with lupus and stuff, like what I've got going on, it's a collagen problem. That's what it comes down to. Elastin, that makes things flexible. Actually, when women are pregnant, their bodies produce more elastin with the intent of making their hip and pelvic joints more flexible to prepare for birth. Crazy, but true. You can get more flexible actually when you're pregnant until you get so big that you can't bend at all. They also make antibodies. They are part of the complement immune system, and they are in your muscles. Obviously, proteins are in your muscles. Myoglobin is one that releases oxygen to your muscles. Without that, your muscles don't function. You can't exercise, you can't move. Ferritin stores and releases oxygen, right? Look at that, Fer. Where have we seen that before? What is Fe? What element is Fe? Iron, right, good. Anytime you hear ferrous, whatever, that's iron, right? Okay, so it's got iron in it and it stores and releases oxygen. Well, that makes sense, right? Because hemoglobin, remember we talked about hemoglobin having to have iron. That's how you get oxygen through your body, is the red blood cells right here, these guys. Signaling proteins, proteins in your blood, there's your hemoglobin. Fibrogen, albumin. Albumin is like the liquid in your blood, the free floating liquid in your blood. If you take all your cells out of the way, that's what you get. Then you got your enzymes and then all these different things involved in your cells, membranes, receptors, proceptors, all it's really involved. So your homework real quick. So you guys were to think about your favorite food source, chicken, beef, beans, whatever, cheese, and then research whatever steak. I know you love steak, and research what types of proteins might be in it and try and draw it, which sometimes is really hard. Does anybody remember? You probably remember what you picked. You picked steak. Do you remember what the protein was?
It was like a big long rope kind of thing.
Like a rope. There you go.
Like a really thick rope.
Yeah.
Turn that in.
Yeah, you can turn it in. Yeah, with some of these are really interesting to look at. They're crazy looking, right? They don't even look real. They're all bendy and wacky, but it's a lot of fun. All right, cool. So we've got one more lesson next week. That's DNA. Then you guys will have your final unit test. You're gonna wrap up the unit test and you'll have time. We'll have like a class, full class of study, prep. And then we'll roll off into our final. We are almost done. You guys realize that, right? We are almost done. One more lesson. This is the last week you're gonna have actual homework, right? You'll have to finish a lab if you don't finish it in class, I think, but that's it, right? That's not much, man. We're almost there. Does it feel like summer to anybody yet? Anybody else feeling the summer bug? Is it just me?
I want summer.
Jocelyn wants summer. Jocelyn's in a hoodie because she's freezing. It's gonna be 81 here.
Oh,
How about
I
you,
love all
Senya?
my sheets too, and that's a comforter, a thick blanket, and a sheet.
Probably when I go outside later, I'm probably gonna be hot in these.
How
I
about
just
you,
want
Senya? You
summer
ready for
pool.
summer?
Yeah, I want to swim in pool.
Yeah, swimming in the pool sounds like it's kind of
Go
fun.
to camp. I want to get out of my house. Not saying my house isn't good.
I
just
feel
want
ya.
to get out.
Well, I think I'm going to feel a lot more like summer next week because we've done a lot of work on our yard getting ready. And Thursday and Friday, the landscaper's supposed to come and he's going to put new mulch and stone down. And then our backyard will be so much prettier and it'll be more accessible. And I can't wait. And we'll have to have a fire pit. Maybe if we can't do the swimming this year, because I'm not sure it's going to work out with the weirdness going on at the pool because all the COVID stuff, maybe we can, do a fire pit one night or something instead. I don't know. I'm always cool for fire pit.
My play is in like 4 days.
Oh, what is it?
Minnesota.
What? Matilda. Oh, you're doing Matilda? Really? Mansions version, the musical? Where are you doing it?
Off Broadway, like this music.
Can you tell your mom to send me that info? I would love to go if there's still spots, because that's a great show. We went and saw that on Broadway. Actually, it was on the 27th that we went, I think, or the 26th. So this is the anniversary of us going. All right, let me let you ladies go, and we'll see everybody next week as we are wrapping up. Y'all have a good one. Bye. Yeah, that's
Bye.
a great musical.
Danny.
Yes.